Good afternoon and welcome back, ladies, gents and Pikachus, to another analysis and breakdown of the Quran of the Muslims. But in the evenings now, we're going to break the episodes in two. So the first episode is going to be this, going through this, translating, reading and understanding actual pages of Quran in detail so that we can understand this book, which is the basis of Muslim culture and the kind of leader of Muslim culture. All the luminaries of the Muslim culture, they all bow to this thing, every single one of them. What we're going to do in the evenings, i.e. now, is we're going to look into the news sources from Mecca, Egypt, Palestine, these kind of things, so we can break down how this affects them in the current day. Because if we are to understand Islam, we need to understand the Muslim. And if we are to understand the Muslim, we need to understand their culture from their perspective. So that's what we're going to do now. We're going to go into some Muslim writings about themselves and each other. And we're going to break this down in terms of if they were here, how we would react to them, how we would see them. And also, I suppose it would be interesting to look at how they would treat us if we went there and did what they're doing in their countries. So, first thing I want to look at is a little website which is a luminary of the Islamic world. This guy is considered to be a big scholar, and the reason they think he's so perfect is because obviously in Islam, if someone is a mosque scholar, you have to praise them up, which means you give them credit they're not due. You tell other people how great they are when they don't deserve it. And also, you hide their sins and you cover up and you lie for them so that they don't have any sins. So that's this guy. He has no sins. Nobody is willing to speak up against him. He's apparently done nothing wrong ever, and he's such a lovely, great guy. But let's have a look at what he writes to see whether that marries up with this vision of perfection he wants to claim. So here is Sayyid al-Ben Hussein Daskahabi Sharazi, who is a luminary. Like I said, he's one of the most respected guys in that part of the world. Now, he's writing here from his knowledge of the Quran, and as we can see, he's saying it's not advisable to be respectful towards non-believers. He's directly saying non-believers should be degraded and treated poorly because they are not deserving of respect, because they don't worship and obey only Allah. So actually, the things that I've said in the past, and then I've been roundly attacked by random Muslims, that's the reason they turn up to attack me. In their heads, they are doing a righteous and a good thing. And then if we extrapolate that out to whole countries, that means that the whole Muslim country attacking a whole non-believer country is considered to be righteous, moral, and a good thing that is supported by the Quran and the laws of Allah. So I'd ask you this, how do you think that affects the Muslim's mind, individually? So there you go. That guy apparently has had no sins as well, and that's why he writes so conclusively about every single thing that is mentioned within the Quran. He writes about all the different Islamic countries, and he's very critical of Britain and America for things he says are moral sins. But how can this guy talk about moral sins and insult our countries and us personally when he is saying things like that? Not to mention the fact that this guy has been accused of sexual abuse several times and has never ever been investigated or punished for it. And the reason is because we know. You have to preach up your brothers in Islam, and those who cover the sins of their brothers with lying are loved the most by Allah. And this guy's obviously loved the most by Allah, so that suggests he is one of these people that lies constantly in order to cover up the sins of Islam and himself and others. So I ask you, while we've been reading the Quran, and I've been getting all this criticism from Muslims, do we think that they're criticising me fairly? Or, like this guy that we just looked at, do we think they're criticising me as a mission for Allah? Do they think they're doing a good, righteous thing by excusing their own bad behaviour and making up lies against me and my work simply because I'm a non-believer? I'll let you answer that. You know, it's not up to me to judge these guys now that they're attacking me. I would be in bias. I have a bias against them because they've attacked me. So you have to make your own mind up on that. But we move on. So another thing that I wanted to look at, since we've recently had the Hajj, or whatever it's called, you know, the pilgrimage to Mecca where they go around the black cube thing, I wanted to talk to you about that because, as we know from our reading of here, pilgrimage is such an important thing in the life of every single Muslim. It's demanded that you do it. It's so heavily demanded that if you don't do this pilgrimage, you die as an infidel. And it even says in the Quran, if you don't do your pilgrimage and you don't have a really good excuse for it, you are as bad as a Christian or Jew. And that means you're like a demon. And we know that's what this says. That's not me making this up. Muslims believe this in their daily lives. That's the reason why they behave the way they do towards us. But anyway, let's have a look at some more articles in the news, in Mecca news, regarding what happens at these Hajj pilgrimage journeys. So first we're going to look at Muslim Mecca news, and the story is Muslim women speak out about sexual assaults in Mecca, where hundreds of Muslim women shared on social media their experiences of being sexually harassed in what they had previously thought was the holiest city, in which they thought people were going to behave themselves well because it's a main place within Meccan Islamic worship. But obviously that's not what happened. So the first thing I noticed about this article, once I'd read the headline and read through the whole article in detail, none of the men who are abusers, who these hundreds of women have reported, get that, there's hundreds of women making hundreds of reports, not one Muslim man was named in this article as being punished, even though the police were called on many of these occasions. And that's directly a result of this. Covering the sins of your brothers, preaching up, it's what Allah says is righteous and good, and it doesn't lend itself to the protection of women, especially when there's large crowds. And that's what these women found out. There's no protection for them in this large crowd, even at Mecca, right next to the holiest site, right next to the Kaaba cube. As we continue reading, it doesn't get much better. It started with revelations by victims of sexual assault and harassment in Hollywood, the Me Too movement. Now Muslim women are speaking up ahead of their experiences of assault during Umrah and Hajj pilgrimages to Mecca. Quote, I've experienced it before, twice. The first time was in my early 20s while I was doing Umrah. A guy was touching me from behind. The second time was during a Hajj a few years later. When I was doing tawaf around the Kaaba, a guy kept following me and rubbing up against me. At first, I thought it was a mistake, given the context of where they were. But it was so crowded, I couldn't turn around to see who it was. And when I eventually did, I saw a guy staring right at me and smiling. And it must have continued for about 5 to 10 minutes as I kept trying to reach the rest of the group that I had arrived with, and I felt terrified. The incident definitely scarred me for life. You would expect this to happen anywhere else in the world but Mecca, she says, and she felt humiliated and baffled by the incident, leaving her unable to respond. Interestingly enough, the only defence that they gave for this in the actual article was to, at the side of the article, in the recommended links, point people towards Israeli soldiers committing crimes in Palestine. And these crimes are things such as clearing away women's underwear and then displaying them proudly on the wall. So what they're trying to do there is say it's the Jews, not them. And that's the covering up of sins and the preaching up of their religion. So I think we can see from this evidence already where this particular line of inquiry is going to lead us. And where it's going to lead us is back to this book being the source of the evils of the Muslim. Because you can guarantee yourself these guys have mothers, these guys have daughters, wives, friends who are female. The only reason they think this is okay to do, and actually cover up with lies, is because Allah tells them if they don't, they are infidels. So it's the opposite of our culture. Our culture is one of you reduce people's ability to commit crime by openly speaking against them. And if there are witnesses to come forward, we protect the witnesses and we encourage them to give their testimonies and their evidence. But in this culture, it seems like there's a culture of hiding and covering up and lying so that the sins of the Muslim are not recognised and hidden. And then they can say, well, Muslims are great, they behave great. Despite the fact that these women have come out to say this, no evidence was found. These guys were not punished. So anyway, let's carry on reading. She continued, you would expect this to happen anywhere in the world but Mecca, added Omar, who said she felt humiliated and baffled by the incident, leaving her unable to respond. Now, it's interesting that you would expect this to happen anywhere else but in Mecca. That's almost like saying the rest of the world has all the sin, and Mecca has none of it. And this is a direct result of people preaching up and covering the sins of their brothers. It creates a false expectation of purity. And it's just disappointing for these women when they finally arrive in Mecca and they find it's one of the most vulnerable places for them. And they're likely to be attacked. And not only are they likely to be attacked, the people who attack them are likely to know that they're going to get away with it and not be investigated, and that no witnesses will be coming forward. While many Muslim women say they get a sense of serenity in Mecca, hundreds of others have spoken up in the past few days about their experiences of sexual harassment in what they thought should be the holiest city on earth. And then it lists another person in a different year, 2013, who was the progenitor of the Mosque Me Too movement. This woman was one of the first to make that hashtag and to make it famous. And she is a Pakistani woman who was assaulted in Mecca in 2013. So we can see this is an ongoing thing. No way to report. While Yasmin told MEE, that's Mecca Egyptian Inquirer, the newspaper, while Yasmin told MEE that if she was able to discern who it was, she could have confronted the offender and reported him to police, other women complained about not having anyone to report incidents to. Quote, "There are police here, but with the crowds it's very difficult to reach them. I also didn't feel like the police would have taken what I said seriously," added Omar, as she recalled Saudi police once berating her when her headscarf had slipped and some of her strands of hair had been on show. While many women have spoken up about the experiences of physical and sexual assault in Mecca, many more have shared accounts of other forms of harassment, and that's going to be online. And then the quote says, "I was naive going there, thinking that Mecca was the safest place, when it actually turned out to be the opposite." And that's exactly what I'm saying, is the culture of Islam, especially in places like Mecca, it gives you the opposite expectation of how things really are. So this unfortunate story shows us the treatment of women who are with their families. Sometimes their brothers or their husbands are actually there, and it makes no difference. They are prey. They are targets for sexual abuse when they go to these places. And as we saw from that woman's reporting, the reason the problem is so bad is because A, they have a false expectation of safety, because they are told that everyone there is Islamic, so that means they're safe. And then when they arrive there, they realise that because they are Islamic, the women there are unsafe. And when it comes to reporting to police, the police are more interested in punishing them for showing their hair and their flesh than they are in trying to catch the actual sexual abusing men who have perpetrated these crimes on these victims. But how do things go when they are not family there? When you don't have a wife, a brother, a husband? When there's no men there to stick up for you? Maybe you're an orphan child like we read in the last part of Quran. What happens to you then? What is the situation for you when you have no one to stick up for you and you're just a helpless child? Let's have a look at some more news articles regarding that. Next up, I want to look at an article from a Mecca orphanage in Giza in Egypt, in which an orphanage manager was sentenced to 3 years in prison and a fine for beating up the children there, beating the orphans. So as you can see in the picture here, here's him proudly kicking one of the children, and here it looks like he's beating them with some kind of club. Like you can see the head on the club, the child lying on the floor, and a child in red behind watching on in dismay. Following the emergence of a disturbing video of orphans being beaten and verbally abused, a criminal court in Giza sentenced the manager of the orphanage to 3 years in prison and a fine of 1,000 of their currency, which I'm sure is worth next to nothing, for endangering the lives of 7 children whom he was filmed beating at the orphanage last month. See, they had a film of it. There's evidence. That's something that you don't usually get. Let's carry on. The defendant had already been sentenced to 2 years for using brute force on the infant boys and girls aged between 7 and 10 years old under his supervision. According to the Veto newspaper, that's an Italian newspaper, and it's not a Muslim newspaper, a 3rd year was added onto his sentence and a 1,000 fine for possession of a weapon, a rod used to beat the orphans. The abuse suffered by the children at the orphanage was evidenced by another video that circulated online shortly after it's filmed on the 1st of August. Holding a wooden rod in his hand, Osama Othman, the manager of the Mecca orphanages in Giza, was filmed by his wife as he beat, slapped, kicked and cursed 7 orphans. The children were filmed crying, holding themselves in pain, running or limping away from the abuse following the beatings. And unfortunately, this is what you will see in a culture which has no supervisory authority, which doesn't respect the legitimacy of evidence and of testimonies, and does everything in front of Allah. That's the only reason why you would care about these things. It says in here, Allah is your witness. Allah is the one who you are trying to please. If you do everything that Allah has told you to do, then it's considered that you have treated other people fairly. And as we can see in these situations, the only reason these people were punished is because the wife put a video in the hands of a foreign journalist. Italian journalist, Vito. That's the only reason this came out. And think about it like this, okay? If you were in this country and you were an orphanage manager and you beat 7 children, one of them you beat with a rod, and they were limping around with injuries, broken bones and such, and there was a video that went out, do you think there would be a 3-year prison sentence and a small fine, or do you think the law would come down on you like a ton of bricks and you would probably have a decade in prison and a fine, a huge fine? It would be hundreds of thousands you'd be paying. And the reason is because we have a culture which encourages victims to come forward, which encourages the creation of evidence and looking at that evidence with the logical eye. We don't have a culture like these guys do of covering these things up and trying to make it appear to other people, at least, that there's nothing to be criticised. Everything's fine and it's all under the watchful guidance of Allah. The newspaper Gulf News, which is sponsored again by foreign companies. Orphan tortured to death over $4 in Egypt. A 14-year-old boy was subjected to horrific torture for 2 hours for demanding wages. There's so much wrong with this, right? That's the poor kid there. So I want to know why he's getting wages when he's only 14 and why he is having to argue over $4 worth of wages. I mean, I wonder what his job is. So we can see the call to prayer speaker tower in the background there. So this is happening inside of mosque grounds. That's what we know. There's a mosque right there. We can see the mast in the background. So let's read on. A 14-year-old boy, orphaned boy, was tortured for 2 hours by his employer in Egypt simply because of demanding his daily wages of 50 Egyptian pounds, which is the $4. Local media reported he died from his abuse. The boy was said to be working at a poultry slaughterhouse for 7 months before the crime took place, so he was only just 14. He could have been 13 when he started being, working in this slave place. According to initial investigations, Saleh Tamer was subjected to her horrific torture party for 120 minutes, which ended with his death inside the slaughterhouse located in the Mount Suhail village of the Sharqiya Governorate. Police investigations also revealed that the victim's torture party began when he asked the slaughterhouse owners to give him his daily wage for the previous day, saying that he could no longer continue to work at the slaughterhouse because someone was harassing him and pressuring him throughout the day for continuous work without rest. Now think about that. For that simple reason, the suspects, the slaughterhouse owners, started beating and torturing the child with fire, causing his health condition to deteriorate seriously, which prompted them to take him to a nearby clinic, where doctors told him that the child had gone into a coma and he must be taken to a proper hospital to save his life. However, he was declared dead upon arrival in the Al-Sayedin Central Hospital in Minya al-Camp. So once again, we see that the perpetrators of these horrific crimes, they show absolutely no remorse until there is evidence that they cannot hide, i.e. a dead body or a 14-year-old boy who's in a coma covered in burns. And you have to ask yourself, why, when faced with that situation, didn't they just go straight to the hospital? They went to a local clinic because they knew this guy's a Muslim, he will help us cover up our crimes and praise up what we have done with our slaughterhouse, who employs 14-year-old orphans as slaves, effectively. He won't even give them $4. That's what he was asking for. He was saying, look guys, I've been here 7 months. Can I have 1 day of wages? $4, please. And because he kept on asking and he wouldn't take no for an answer, they beat him and burnt him until he was so badly injured that he fell into a coma and died. And even then, they wouldn't even take him to a hospital. Why do people behave like this? Do we think that Egyptians or Meccans are just evil? No, of course we don't. Their guide for morality is this book. That's why these things happened in the past, why they happen now, and why they're going to continue to happen, and why if we in our country here don't recognise this and actually take steps to remedy the scenario, the situation for ourselves here, we are inviting and encouraging this kind of thing in. Because as we know, they're not going to tell us the truth. They're going to praise up and they're going to cover the sins of their brothers because Allah told them it's righteous. Not only that, we are scummy non-believers. They have no respect for us. Allah tells them they should treat us poorly and they should harass us and lie about us and accuse us of things we haven't done so that they can avoid being blamed for the things they have done, and we can be treated as infidels while they can be treated like respectful, faithful Muslims. So that's all the evidence we're going to go through today. I think it's fair to say you all have a good education, okay? I don't need to wax lyrically about the horrors that we just went through in those videos. But I want people to know, when I'm going through my Without Lies, Islam Dies series, in which we break down this book verse by verse, and Muslims are appearing in my comments pretending to be Jews, pretending to be Christians, pretending that they're upset and they're personally wounded and offended by the things which I am saying, or that I'm lying, or that I'm biased, we know. The reason that they are saying that is not because they are offended, or biased, or because I'm lying. It's because they're doing it for Allah's reward. Allah will call them an infidel, a disobedient infidel who is as bad as a Christian or a Jew, of which I am both. So if you put all that together, they are racists who are attacking me and my work so that they can cover up the sins of their brothers and praise up Islam, as Allah has commanded them to do. Otherwise, they will be infidels and they will burn in hell. And it was exactly the same story with the child who died at the orphanage. It was exactly the same story at the children who were beaten at another orphanage. And it was exactly the same story with those poor women who were the victims of sexual assault, where nobody was punished. And we will see these crimes continue, and we'll see them come here, and we'll see them continue here, unless we do something about it now. And the thing we can do about it is learn this page by page, verse by verse, ignore the critics, if they're Muslims, because they're going to be biased, as we know from this book. Read through it verse by verse, learn it, and then we can figure out, A, what they're doing and how they're doing it, and B, what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. And we have to find a way that we can punish these guys for the crimes they are committing without being afraid, without being scared of being called Islamophobe or racist. Justice and the mercy of the victims is more important than people calling you names. And that's the point I want to end this video on. Mercy is higher than justice. We need to show mercy for the victims of these people and their crimes, then show justice to the people who have committed the crimes. And if we are to do those two things, it means we need to be honest, we need to see the evidence, we cannot be put off by insults, threats of racism or Islamophobia, where they try to make us look bad so that they can cover up their own sins, as Allah tells them to do. So that's the end of this video. Hope you enjoyed that and you learnt something. God bless, and I'll see you, lovely people, in the next one. Bye now. So that's all for today. I'll be back tomorrow at 7:15 AM with the next Without Lies, Islam Dies. We'll go through some more evidence and some more Quran readings. Until then, have a lovely evening. God bless you all. And I will see you, wonderful, very intelligent people, in the next one. Bye now. Bye 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 bye.